Hi, my name is Chris Gibbons. I'm going to be your guest lecturer for today, and our topic is Research Ethics, a Historical Perspective. In today's brief lecture, we're going to be looking at how research ethics have developed and the current framework for research ethics. We're also going to look at historical cases that have promoted the development of research ethics, and in that we're going to highlight the Tuskegee and Willowbrook cases. We're going to look at the contributions of Henry Beecher to research ethics. And then lastly, we're going to look at how are research ethics addressed and regulated today. Let's look at how research ethics developed. In general, it was a response to a moral conflict. And that conflict came about from abuses and mistreatment found within many studies. These studies have caused harm to people, even death. Now, it's not that researchers were intending to harm their subjects, though some have historically, but by and far most did not have a malevolent intent. But what research ethics is trying to do is to provide some guidelines, some external agencies, some core principles that prevent these abuses and mistreatments from happening. So what has come about from all this are some core principles for research ethics, and we have them in these four general areas. The first one is protection from harm. I think that seems the most common sense, not to hurt other people. The other one is a somewhat modern construct, and that is informed consent. That people participating in studies know what they are participating in, have the ability to understand what they are participating in, and that information is clearly conveyed. Also, researchers should be able to give their subjects privacy if they so choose, and many of them do, that they have that right to privacy for their protected information. And then lastly is this concept of justice. And this one means that in general, that a group of individuals that is being studied, do they have a benefit, or will they tend to get a benefit from that research? Or are they being selected for that research to benefit another population? And we'll see a couple of populations here where this is very evident, that a particular population was used for a study, and that's usually one that is more at risk, one that is more susceptible to be manipulated than others. So when we look at that level playing field, is that happening here? Is the research going to be able to benefit those that are participating in the research? Is one of the fundamental things that you look at with the justice concept. All right, now that we've gone over the responses to the moral conflicts, the core principles, let's look at a couple of cases. And as we talk about these cases, I want you to see them through the lens of these core principles and identify which areas that they have triggered and help responded to this development for ethics within research. Let's look at our first case, the Tuskegee study. And with both of our cases, we're going to approach them the same way. First, we'll look at a study summary. We're going to then look at the aspects that influenced research ethics that came out of that study. And then we're going to talk about, could this happen today? Well, the Tuskegee study was named after the historical black college, the Tuskegee Institute, but they were only loosely associated with this rather large longitudinal study that ran from 1932 to 1972 and observed the effects of untreated syphilis in 600 African American men from poor and rural parts of Alabama. Of the men that were studied, 2/3 of them were found to have syphilis. Now, the problem with this study that would influence research ethics is that none of the men participating in the study, again, a total of 600 with 2/3 having syphilis, were told that they had syphilis. The men were told they were being treated for something called bad blood, which was a whole host of diseases that were commonly used with the colloquialism bad blood. You have to remember these were farmers in rural Alabama with little or any medical knowledge. Also, even more conflicting with this particular study, as it ran for many, many years, over 40 years, that none of the men were told about a cure. As the study was running, in 1947, penicillin became widely recognized as a cure for syphilis. None of those men who had syphilis during this study were told of the cure. The study only ended in 1972 after a whistleblower informed the media. All right, so let's take a look at some of the aspects that influence research ethics. Well, first one is informed consent. None of the men were told they had syphilis. They weren't making decisions from information to participate. Yes, they agreed to participate, but the information provided was very imperfect, very one-sided. They were also told they were being treated for bad blood. Again, not very precise information. So we definitely have issues with informed consent. Also, the concept of justice is definitely brought in with this particular group. We are looking at individuals, many who could not read, from poor and rural parts of Alabama, some of the poorest parts of the United States, with minimal education, that were being brought into this study, if not even targeted into this study. And then the fact that when a cure was available and widely known to the researchers in the medical community, it was not offered to the men who they knew were positive for syphilis. So again, some major aspects from this particular case that went on to influence some of those core principles that we talked about in the previous slide. Now, could this happen today? Well, I would hope not, especially in the United States or in any Western country that this type of study could happen. Clearly, with a population that was vulnerable and with the criminal, almost criminal hiding of information of a cure to individuals that they knew that could have been cured, is something that would not happen today, if not for just the ethical outrage for legal ramifications as well, would simply be illegal in the United States. But we will talk about, could it happen, somewhere else? Now that is a possibility. Let's look at our next case. That's the Willowbrook study. Willowbrook was a state institution for intellectually disabled children in New York City. Medical studies were carried out there between the years of 1956 and 1971, examining hepatitis among the children, which was actually common at the school because of sanitary conditions. Now, as far as the aspects that influenced the research ethics that came out of this case study, one was that as children were recruited to be part of the study, their parents were offered the option for their children to participate in these studies. Their parents were the ones that gave consent for these studies to happen. But as part of being in that study, the parents were told that the children would receive special care from a well-staffed unit that guaranteed admission into the facility. And the facility was already at capacity and overcrowded in many cases. So as far as parents wanting to get their children into this facility, their only option was to accept to be part of the study. Now that has a problem unto its own, but it gets even worse in that children that were brought into the study were intentionally infected with the hepatitis virus. And it was not clear to the parents who were consenting for their children to enter the study that that was going to happen. So we have two issues going on here, if not more. First one is justice. We have a population that is at risk, a population that is not on the same playing field as other populations. You have desperate parents seeking care for their children and with limited options available to them. Many of these parents were from lower income to lower middle class income and simply could not afford care elsewhere. This was their only option. And then the only option to get into the school or to get into this institution was to enter the study because the institution was already at capacity. So you have a population that is being preyed upon, if you will, in order to get them into the study. Then the children being infected with a disease to be part of the study intentionally has a whole host of issues as well. And the parents not being clearly told that their children were going to be infected with hepatitis intentionally was not made clear. So we also have issues with informed consent, with the parents not receiving complete, transparent information to make a choice. And then we also have the issue of harm, actual harm being done to these children. Now, the researchers argued that the children would have gotten hepatitis anyway. There was a very, very high rate in the upper 90s of everybody having hepatitis in this facility. But nevertheless, if they entered the study, they were 100% guaranteed to get hepatitis. Now, could this happen today? No, this could not happen today. For many of the reasons that the Tuskegee situation could not happen today in the United States, with legal protections, with other protections that we'll talk about towards the end of today's lecture, it would be very difficult for these egregious errors, these egregious actions to happen. The turnaround in research ethics was led by Henry Breacher. Dr. Breacher was an anesthesiologist and researcher at Harvard University. He had done a lot of his research work in the placebo effect, but he turned his later career towards research ethics and is known as the father of contemporary research ethics with the publication of his very important paper, Ethics and Clinical Research in 1966. Now, this particular paper was so important that it was called the Breacher bombshell and made news nationwide, not just in academia. The reason why this particular publication was so important is that Dr. Breacher pulled the curtain back on these ethical and moral issues that were happening in research in the United States. He highlighted the Tuskegee study along with 22 other very challenging studies and really opened up and changed public perception as far as how research is to be conducted. One of the interesting facts is that Dr. Breacher felt that informed consent was the first and most important of the core principles with research ethics. His second area that he felt that was as important was centered around safety and care of the subjects being studied. But without Dr. Breacher's bombshell in 1966, many of the changes that were soon to come in the early 70s would not have been ushered in. If you look at when the Tuskegee study ended, which was 1972, also when you look at the Willowbrook study ending around that same time as well, all of these challenging studies within the United States were pretty much defunct by the early 70s. Again, thanks to Dr. Breacher and his 1966 bombshell exposing the issues and challenges with research. Some of the direct effects of the Breacher bombshell is really how we address research ethics today and how it's regulated. First, there are federal laws. Some of the things that were done are simply illegal now. One of the areas addressed, which is not part of our lecture today, is animal welfare, but the Animal Welfare Act of 1966 for animal research began that process. But as a direct effect from Breacher's bombshell is the National Research Act of 1974, and then later on we have the Health Research Extension Act of 1985. These are federal laws that are in place that make many of these things that have happened in the past simply illegal. Now, outside of federal laws and state laws as well, we have internal processes to ensure that research is done ethically. And that's primarily done through institutional review boards, or IRBs. They may be called research ethics boards as well, ERBs, but they all have the same intent. And that is to review the study being proposed under those core principles when we look at ethics and research. Are they not doing harm? Is there justice in place? Is there informed consent necessary? Now, with institutional review boards, if any institution is taking federal money in the form of grants or whatnot to support that research, the IRBs are absolutely mandated. And as a standard practice, even institutions that are not taking any federal funds for their research, it is a practice that institutional review boards are used to review that research to ensure that there is a thorough vetting of that research before it goes into place. So there are some mechanisms today that allow that oversight. The IRBs are composed of individuals, usually cross-disciplinary, that will look at the research being proposed. They will not look at the research study for any kind of scientific validity. That will be done by other groups. It's whether how the study is conducted. It's really looking from, is it through that moral lens, through that ethical lens. So we do have mechanisms in the United States today to prevent some of these atrocities that have happened in the past. It doesn't mean it's foolproof, but it does allow for some additional oversight in these processes. Now, before we end today's lecture, I want to ask you a question. Do you think the abuse and mistreatment within research that we saw in Tuskegee, in Willowbrook, could it still happen today? Now, I'd argue in the United States it'd be very difficult. There are laws in place, there are institutional review boards in place, the media scrutiny is so much more that it simply would not be able to happen in the United States. But we do have a couple of issues that are on the horizon. The first one being technology. As technology continues to race forward, will research ethics be able to keep pace? We've already seen issues in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I'm sure more will be on the horizon. Also think of this. Though studies like Tuskegee and Willowbrook couldn't happen here in the United States, could some researcher do them in another country? Perhaps Venezuela, or let's say even El Salvador, where there might be far less, if any, oversight at all? Could some multinational company use a shell company to promote research in an area, in a country where there are no checks or balances? So as you can see, there are always going to be challenges with research ethics, and it's for us to be vigilant and trying to combat those and maintaining those core principles.